The island of Peleliu was only 6 miles long, a coral tooth in the Pacific, yet in September 1944 it became one of the costliest square miles of ground in the entire war. The planners of Operation Stalemate II had promised it would fall in 4 days. The airfield was small, the garrison modest, and the overall campaign map already pointed west toward the Philippines. What no map could show was the labyrinth of coral ridges rising behind that airfield, ridges honeycombed with caves, tunnels, and fighting positions the Japanese had spent months turning into a fortress. To the men of the 1st Marine Division landing on Orange Beach, Peleliu looked at first like every other Pacific invasion: surf, smoke, and the scream of naval shells overhead. Within hours, the beaches were jammed with wrecked amphibious tractors and burning palm trunks. Temperatures topped 110 degrees. The coral reflected the heat like a mirror. By the second day, canteens were empty and the smell of rotting fish mixed with cordite in the air. The Marines advanced inland toward a jagged rise on the northern end of the island. On maps it was marked simply as Hill 100, but the men would call it Bloody Nose Ridge. From its crest, Japanese artillery and mortars dominated the airfield below, cutting down any attempt to cross the open ground. To reach that ridge meant climbing slopes of razor-edged coral under machine gun fire so precise it seemed mechanical. Battalion after battalion tried, were repelled, regrouped, and went again. By the time Colonel Harris radioed Division Command on September 27, his battalion had been reduced to half strength. Yet when the order came to hold the ridge line overnight, no retreat, no rotation, the surviving men dug in among the rocks and bodies. They had no illusions left about victory or defeat. They understood only that the hill could not be surrendered, because every drop of blood already spilled demanded it be kept. Night fell like a curtain over Peleliu, erasing the horizon and trapping sound inside the ridges. The Marines on Bloody Nose Ridge crouched behind fragments of coral and broken weapons, listening for the movement they knew would come. At dusk, stretcher-bearers had dragged the last wounded men down the slope under fire, leaving only those who could still fight. Mortar crews checked their tubes by touch. Rifle bolts clicked quietly in the dark. Every man knew the Japanese would counterattack. They always did when night came. The first flare went up just after midnight. Its white light showed the ridge crawling with figures. Japanese infantry were moving in coordinated waves, slipping through trenches and side tunnels that the defenders hadn't even seen in daylight. They carried satchel charges, bayonets, and grenades wired together in clusters. Some wore strips of white cloth on their sleeves to recognize each other in the dark. Others wore nothing at all. The flares burned out and the hill returned to blackness, then erupted in muzzle flashes. Machine guns cut arcs through the night, their tracers slicing across the slope. Mortar shells burst so close that the fragments peppered the Marines' own positions. One section leader kept shouting fire corrections until a fragment caught him in the throat. Another man, his hands burned raw from feeding belts, switched barrels in the dark and kept firing. The Japanese kept coming, crawling over the bodies of their dead, forcing the Marines back to the edges of the ridge. When the firing slackened, the screams began, hand-to-hand fighting in the crevices, where knives, entrenching tools, and even bare hands decided who lived through the next minute. By 300 hours, the attack had reached the battalion command post. Harris moved his men into a semicircle around the cave mouth and ordered every remaining mortar fired at minimum range, danger close, less than 60 meters. The shells exploded on the forward slope, showering coral dust and shrapnel into friend and foe alike. It stopped the Japanese assault cold. When dawn rose pale and colorless, the slope below the ridge looked like it had been clawed by giants. Hundreds of bodies lay tangled in the rock. The men of Harris's battalion had held, but the hill had earned its name. When daylight returned on September 28, the air above Bloody Nose Ridge shimmered with heat and flies. The Japanese guns that had survived the night opened fire again from hidden apertures, forcing the Marines to flatten against the rock. Corpsmen crawled from hole to hole with morphine syrettes between their teeth, stepping over men who no longer needed them. The radio hummed with broken messages, requests for ammunition, stretcher details, artillery corrections, but there was one order repeated and acknowledged by every company on the line: hold. Division Command had considered pulling Harris's battalion back to reorganize, but the terrain offered no alternate position. If the ridge fell, the airfield fell, and if the airfield fell, every man on Peleliu would be trapped. So the decision was made higher up and passed down in plain words: no withdrawal authorized. The men accepted it without protest. They were too tired to argue and too aware of what retreat meant. Many dug fresh fighting pits beside the bodies of friends, using helmets as shovels, the coral slicing their palms until the blood mixed with the white dust. At mid-morning, Japanese mortars zeroed in again. The explosions tore new craters into the ridge and sent coral shards scything through the trenches. Harris's remaining platoon leaders tried to count their men and gave up. Every roster was useless now. Ammunition was rationed to single clips. One Browning gun ran until its barrel glowed red, then jammed solid. Its crew turned the weapon on its side and used it as cover. Around noon, runners brought word that another regiment would relieve them within 24 hours. No one believed it. They had learned by now that promises traveled faster than replacements. What kept them on the ridge wasn't hope or even obedience. It was momentum, an unwillingness to give back what had already been bought at such price. By late afternoon, the coral slopes were littered with wrecked packs, broken rifles, and the wreckage of both armies. Harris stood among his men, eyes sunburned to slits, and looked down toward the airfield they had sworn to protect. The Japanese still held the heights beyond, but Bloody Nose Ridge was theirs for now. And as dusk approached again, everyone knew the next assault would come with the dark. The second night on Bloody Nose Ridge began with a false calm. The wind carried the smell of the sea up the slopes, mingling with the heavier stench of the dead. The Japanese artillery had fallen silent, and for a few uneasy hours the Marines dared to believe the enemy might finally be finished. Then, at 2200 hours, the caves erupted again. Dozens of concealed positions along the ridge line spat tracer fire and grenades. Entire sections of hillside seemed to ignite. The Japanese commander, Colonel Nakagawa, had ordered every surviving man of his 2nd Infantry Regiment into a last, coordinated assault. To the defenders it came like a tidal wave in darkness. They advanced from 3 sides, yelling, hurling grenades, and rushing straight into the muzzles of the Marines' guns. It was no longer battle in any organized sense. It was slaughter carried out in flashes of light and sound. The Marines fought back with every weapon left to them: rifles, bars, flamethrowers, and grenades pulled from the pouches of the dead. One mortar crew fired so close to their own trench that the blast blew the paint off their helmets. The ridge became a furnace of flame and coral dust. Sergeant William Waller's section lost half its men in 15 minutes, yet he refused to fall back, shouting that no one would leave their dead behind. When the Japanese tried to crawl through a lateral trench, Waller's men piled sandbags across the entrance and turned it into a killing pit. By midnight, the ridge resembled the mouth of a volcano. Japanese bodies filled every depression, sometimes stacked 3 deep where the terrain funneled them. A Marine lieutenant described the scene later as a mass grave we just kept adding to. Surviving defenders moved among the wreckage like ghosts, throwing stones into the dark to draw fire, then answering it with everything they had left. When dawn came again, the slope below was motionless. Nothing moved except smoke and the flies. Harris radioed Division Command only 5 words: "We still hold the ridge." Peleliu had cost him nearly his entire battalion, but the hill was theirs, and the Japanese regiment below it no longer existed. The 3rd morning on Bloody Nose Ridge dawned silent. No artillery, no movement, only the crackle of small fires among the coral and the low hum of insects already feeding on what was left of the night's battle. The surviving Marines stood among the ruins, sunburned, hollow-eyed, and deafened by days of continuous gunfire. Some hadn't slept since the landing. Others had forgotten what day it was. When the relief battalion finally reached the ridge, they found men too exhausted to speak, sitting beside their weapons like statues carved out of salt and ash. Medics moved among the rocks with stretchers improvised from ponchos and bamboo poles. They stepped over bodies that were impossible to separate. Japanese and American dead fused together in the heat, the coral stained black from burned flesh. Graves registration teams would later call this sector the Ridge of No Names, because many could never be identified. The wounded who could walk helped carry ammunition instead of leaving. There was nowhere safe enough to rest. In the following hours, engineers detonated charges at the entrances of the remaining caves. Each blast sent stones, smoke, and fragments of bone raining across the slope. The Japanese defenders had chosen death over surrender, and most were buried where they fought. Harris refused to allow his men to gloat or desecrate. He simply ordered them to keep digging, fortifying what they had won. When a junior officer asked whether they could finally rotate off the line, Harris answered flatly, "We hold until ordered otherwise." By afternoon, the temperature reached 115 degrees. Water was rationed to a single canteen a day, and even that ran low. The stench grew unbearable. Marines stuffed cigarette butts into their noses to block the smell, their hands shaking as they tried to light them. Above all else, there was a quiet disbelief that anyone had survived this at all. When Division Command finally declared the ridge secure, there was no cheer, no celebration. The men who had refused to retreat had done what was asked and more, but the price had stripped away the word victory. The ridge had been taken, yes, but at a cost that no one on Peleliu would ever forget. In the weeks that followed, the battle for Peleliu dragged on, though the strategic reason for fighting there had already evaporated. Intelligence later confirmed that the island's airfield, the objective that had justified the entire invasion, was never truly essential for the upcoming Philippines campaign. Yet the Marines who had fought and died on Bloody Nose Ridge didn't know that. They only knew they had been told to take it, and they did. After the ridge was secured, engineers blasted and sealed hundreds of Japanese caves, turning much of northern Peleliu into a graveyard encased in coral. When the official reports were written, the hill was listed as Hill 100, captured after sustained engagement. There was no mention of the 70% casualty rate in some companies, or that entire platoons had simply ceased to exist. The men who had refused to retreat were rotated off the line quietly, shipped back to division rest camps where they sat under palm leaves, staring at the sea. Many never spoke about the ridge again. Historians would later argue about whether Peleliu should have been fought at all. Some called it unnecessary, even reckless, a tragedy of planning. Others saw in it a grim microcosm of the Pacific War, courage, sacrifice, and endurance meeting the full cruelty of terrain and doctrine. But among the Marines who were there, no debate was needed. They remembered the heat that blistered the skin, the coral that shredded boots, and the simple order that held them together: no retreat. Bloody Nose Ridge became less a landmark than a lesson carved into memory. It proved that determination could hold when strategy faltered, and that once men commit themselves to a patch of ground, it becomes more than geography, it becomes the measure of their will. When the campaign finally ended in November 1944, Peleliu was declared secure. Out of nearly 11,000 Japanese defenders, only 200 were taken alive. The rest remained in the tunnels and slopes they had sworn to defend. For the Americans, the victory brought no celebration, only silence and the slow realization that they had survived something no words could explain. The ridge still stands today, sun-bleached and quiet, its coral face hiding the story of a hill once lost, and the men who refused to let it go.